Mixed-use precincts are fast becoming powerful engines of tourism, economic growth, and job creation. Welcome to Growthpoint View, a podcast where conversations that matter shape South Africa's built environment. I'm your host, Denise Mhlanga. As investors move away from standalone assets, mixed-use precincts are redefining how cities attract talent, capital, and visitors. Precincts like the V&A Waterfront in Cape Town, Melrose Arch, and Waterfall City in Johannesburg offer a blueprint for resilient and high-impact investments. Joining me today are Graham Wood, the CEO of the V&A Waterfront and hospitality veteran with vast experience in building and operating award-winning precincts, and seasoned real estate executives, Timothy Ivan, the head of asset management for the office portfolio at Growthpoint Properties, and Werner Antwerpen, the head of corporate advisory at Growthpoint Properties. Gentlemen, welcome to Growthpoint View.
Thank you.
Graham, whenever I think of mixed-use precincts, the first thing really I think about is shopping, dining, and entertainment. I hardly think of hotels, the office aspects of it. But tell us about the V&A Waterfront. Where is it today? And what are some of the things that are happening that some of the viewers may not know?
Thanks, Denise. It's great to be here. The V&A, it's quite interesting because a lot of people's first impression of the V&A is a shopping mall. You mentioned food, dining, shopping, etc. But it's so much more than that. It's an integrated precinct. So it is a precinct where people can live, work, and play. But the magic of the V&A is that it is all centered around a working harbour. So it creates this magnet for people because they're attracted to the ocean and what happens within an ocean environment. So we're very blessed to have the working harbour as our anchor. So it gives it a certain degree of character and place and a sense of place which attracts our visitors. But our precinct is more than just the wharf and the harbour. It's we have a commercial portfolio, we have a residential portfolio. So we have 259 apartments on that precinct, and we have third-party residential developments within this precinct, and more to come. And then we have 12 and soon to be a 13th hotel that's going to open on that precinct. So we provide an environment where people can stay short-term in hotels, in a safe, secure, and in an environment where they feel they can be entertained and they can have an amazing retail and marine tourism experience. And there's more to come because we've just received our additional rights for another 440,000 squares, which in addition to what we've still got to build out, will effectively double the size of the waterfront in time to come. So the encouraging thing for us and our shareholders, of which Growthpoint is one, is that we have a master plan and a roadmap for future growth and development of the precinct.
Already you're talking about something that's massive. If you were to put that maybe into soccer fields or rugby fields, how big is the V&A Waterfront and this new opportunities coming into the present? What does that size look like?
Yeah, I read somewhere, I think about the precinct or the existing V&A, they could fit into 80 rugby fields. It's 123 hectares that we have. So forgive me if my calculations are wrong. But if you imagine the retail shopping centre, the wharf at the V&A, which is 75,000 squares. So 5-6 times that is the growth potential that we have. So we currently have a build out of the V&A of about 600,000 squares. So we will as I said, effectively double the size of the precinct.
And you talked about the safety and the experience that the visitors, whether they are and those that are working and shopping, get from the V&A Waterfront. There must be a lot. Talk to us about the curation aspect and the active management of this asset.
The active management is an integral part to the day-to-day operation of the waterfront. So We have an engineering and facilities team of 80 strong plus service providers. So we take responsibility for safety, security, we produce our own water through a desalination plant. We manage our utilities, we manage all our infrastructure ourselves. So there's the day-to-day, and the precinct has to show up every day sparkling. So, we have 250 cleaners around the precinct working day and night to keep it in ship shape, because that's what visitors should expect to see. They should walk onto the precinct and be inspired, because that's what our purpose is. We want to create the world's most inspired waterfront neighborhood. So people need to walk onto the precinct feeling safe, they need to be inspired, and it needs to be a clean environment. So that's on the day-to-day operational side. Then from a development side, we've got to think about our precinct and say, right, where's the future moving, whether it be in Tim's space, in the commercial space? What's the future of work going to look like, and how do we respond to that as our precinct grows? What's the future of retail going to look like, given the big move to online? How do we respond to that? How does it change the nature of our retail? Most of our retail is destination retail, as opposed to convenience shopping, because convenience shopping has been eaten away to some degree by online shopping. And then what are the hotel brands that we have in our precinct, and where's the future of the hotel stay going to look like? What brands don't we have? What travelers should we be attracting that would seek out certain types of hotel and residential experiences? So that's how we go about the developmental side of our precinct in terms of trying to plan for the future.
Timothy, let's bring you in here. What about the occupiers? And when you think about the occupiers, let's talk about the relevancy of the space that you are providing now and into the future. What are some of the elements that make it attractive for them to come to your precinct as opposed to a standalone asset?
Denise, I like the fact that you asked me the question around the occupier, because too often we focus, when it comes to property, on the physical building and the physical infrastructure, but really we should be focusing on the experience that the occupier has. So I think that's what transforms it from just a building into a precinct, which is very important. So from a precinct perspective, we're focused on the occupier and we focused on their needs. Graham's already alluded to the certain fundamentals need to be there. Security needs to be there, electricity, backup, water. These are all topical things at the moment. But to be honest, the occupier doesn't want to worry about those. They just want to know that they're there. And in fact, they don't notice when they're there. They notice when they're not there. And that's the focal point. So call it standard housekeeping. Those elements must be in place. And then there's a second tier. And the second tier is around the experience that the person has. So we've heard a lot of conversations around flexible work from home. What you really are creating here is an environment where people want to come to work. There's absolutely no doubt that if I talk to different business owners and other business heads, they say, flexible work is definitely important, but we do need that physical interaction with people. It's really good for things like culture. It's really good for mentoring. It's really good for identifying our company identity and really forwarding our strategies in our business. So as a property owner, while Graham's spoken a lot about the waterfront, there's definitely more than just one precinct out there. And that's why there's a move from users to say, I need a great place where I can work. And business leaders are identifying that as a need for their business, because after all, it's all about people in the business that are really important.
And Werner, I would like to bring you into the conversation, because when I've listened to Graham and listened to Timothy, this is a massive asset to manage. It must be capital intensive. Why are investors interested in precincts, especially now? And what is your approach as Growthpoint to precinct investments?
One thing that one must remember, if you build a standalone asset anywhere, in the country, that is capital intensive on its own. The issue is that you're spending all that money and then suddenly, the urban infrastructure around you deteriorates. And how do you keep your valuation of your specific asset in that area intact? So, Growthpoint, probably a year or two back, looked at our strategy and said, our portfolio thinking of investments was always that we will invest in key metros. We will invest in Johannesburg, Pretoria, the Cape Town, and also the Durban, Umhlanga area. However, that thinking has now shifted a bit more to say, listen, we need to control more than just the buildings infrastructure. We need to control the surrounding infrastructure as well. It's very successfully done at the V&A, and we actually took the learnings there and see how can we actually adapt that thinking into driving a precinct-led strategy going forward. So that is the next phase in our strategic thinking, making sure that, the urban environment around our assets that we spend the capital on is maintained, and that we will get our returns in those specific investments over a long period that we invest in those areas.
You touched on infrastructure, and infrastructure is a big challenge in South Africa. Some cities are still struggling with that. In Johannesburg, we have seen what's been happening with infrastructure. So when you are thinking of precinct-led investment, is infrastructure on its own? Do you invest in infrastructure first before you actually look at the asset itself?
So infrastructure in a precinct has different components. If you look at the utilities, you have water, electricity, and in my opinion, fiber is also the third utility that you need to look at. And then also the urban infrastructure around a specific precinct. So if you look at what Growthpoint has done over the last couple of years, we've invested heavily in electricity, solar rooftop electricity generation. We just recently invested in large-scale renewable energy plant like the Boston Hydro that we co-invested with. We also looked at how we can wheel electricity to specific buildings to keep the cost and the total cost of occupation down for our tenants as well. And then, in the V&A is a very good example where there's a whole desalination plant that they actually built there. So every stage in the journey of a precinct, you go further in the chain of infrastructure. Also, in the case of the V&A or some other places in Growthpoint, we also own the fiber infrastructure as well. So those things is becoming more relevant for us to maintain, to keep the level of experience for our tenants world-class. And the next phase that we also embarked on now in partnership with others is our involvement with the Cape Winelands airport that's being developed. And that is the next frontier in infrastructure, and that is predominantly driven of getting more tourism into South Africa, and that can actually feed the growth in the Western Cape and specifically V&A going forward as well.
Let's bring in Graham from a tourism perspective. I would imagine a lot of the income from the V&A Waterfront comes from tourism, but I could be wrong, but you're going to talk to us about that. How important is tourism in building, in creating jobs, the economy around you, and contributing income to the Growthpoint Group, and also touching on the Cape Winelands? Are you thinking you are going to see more visitors coming, particularly to your precinct?
Let's talk about the employment aspect of the V&A. So what astounded me when I joined the V&A about 6 months ago was the fact that there are somewhere between 28 and 30,000 people that work at the V&A every day. That's quite an astounding statistic. And the indirect jobs that are created through a consequence of the V&A is about another 50, 60,000 people, 50, 60,000 jobs. So we're a big employer in the center of Cape Town. But you're right, it is all based off the strength of visitation and arrivals. So if you look at our arrivals, we do 25 million visits a year into the V&A. The majority of those are domestic, not international. And there is a perception that it's been raised in various media recently that we're an exclusionary type precinct, and we're not. We're a precinct that depends heavily on domestic visitation. So about 50% of the visits come from Cape Townians. Another 25% are from domestic visitors from Gauteng, KZN, and other parts of the country. And then about 25% of the visits are coming from international arrivals. But what's interesting is that international arrivals contribute in excess of 50% of the spend. And I'm talking about particularly retail and attractions. So what's important is that we continually work to stimulate both international and domestic tourism growth, not just international. But in order to stimulate growth, even domestically, you need additional airlift access, and you need additional capacity. So Cape Town has 230 direct international flights, or 230 international flights a week coming into Cape Town. But those airlines are running at 80% capacity. Okay, put the Middle East crisis aside for a moment, because there's been some volatility on those arrival schedules. But in order for us to grow arrivals, we need additional airlift. But the existing airport cannot really take much more. That's why, not only you're talking about the Winelands, but ACS have announced their 10 billion rand expansion of Cape Town International, including the expansion of the runway. But that's not going to be enough if you're thinking about 10, 15, 20 years' time. If we just think about the V&A, we want to double the size of the V&A. That can only be successful based on additional demand and visitation. So we need the Winelands Airport together with the expansion of the Cape Town Airport, because it'll create the infrastructure that we need to support that growth.
And about the myth that the V&A Waterfront is exclusively tailored for international visitors, what are you doing to attract local travelers?
A lot of our attractions drive domestic visitation, whether it be the boats, whether it be the red ferry that runs around the precinct, whether it be the museums, whether it be restaurants. We have accessible restaurants we have for domestic visitors. Yes, the reason why we're getting a lot of this perception at the moment is because we announced that super yacht marina. And the super yacht marina, and then we announced the Edition Hotel as well, which is in front of that marina, which is definitely targeting the domestic and international luxury traveler, because it is one of the growth sectors in the tourism industry that, despite coming out what's happening around the world and coming out of COVID, it's the one sector in the tourism industry that continues to grow. But the interesting thing about the super yacht marina, as an example, is yes, you can imagine 7, 8 billionaires' yachts mooring in front of the Edition Hotel, the V&A. But what people don't realize is that the industry that supports that marina, whether it be the fuel suppliers, whether it be the provisions of food, whether it be additional consumables, etc., tour operators, helicopter services, etc., those all benefit. The boat building guys benefit when the ships need to go in for repairs. So there's a knock-on effect in terms of economic growth and jobs, even from establishing a high-end super yacht marina.
Timothy, the occupiers, they are in the V&A Waterfront, they are looking at the ocean. Can you recreate that to other precincts within the Cape Town or within Gauteng or Durban, where you are looking to invest in?
The really important thing to understand is that every precinct is unique and has a different reason for being there. Obviously, the waterfront is a very good example, world-class example, and it's clearly defined and known. But if you look even within the Growthpoint portfolio, we have the likes of Sandton Summit, we have the likes of the Woodlands, we have Constantia office environment, we also have Longkloof there in Cape Town. Now, each of those that I've described have a different reason for being. And I think the common theme that we have here is, just like the waterfront is a curated environment to speak to the experience that the client expects there, we do exactly the same in our different environments. So Longkloof might be a more unique, connected experience with the likes of Kloof Street, which is well known. Now you might think, well, in a more office environment, what are you talking about there? It's where people need to come to work, and what would they expect? So it's as simple as making sure that their food needs, coffee needs, being able to get outdoors and experience a bit of the beautiful blue skies that we have here in South Africa. But you can do that in a work environment, in a beautiful, safe environment with, in the case of Woodlands, we've got buck roaming around. We have a boma where people can have functions in this external environment. So what we're talking about is curating the experience for the end user, and that becomes a virtuous cycle, because you can never stop curating and managing it. Is the demand increases, the desire then as an investment platform to invest further grows because you're seeing the demand. And as you invest more, the demand grows. So it's a fantastic virtuous cycle. But I think the important point is that we talk about curation and working on the experience and making sure that it's relevant for what people expect in that environment. Waterfront's a great example, but we've got lots of other examples.
You know what's interesting though? So we were talking before we came into the studio. I went to Longkloof because I wanted to go to an experience, a certain coffee shop, etc. So I left the waterfront to come to Longkloof, and it's a beautiful, I don't know, it's like an urban connected experience. So, and that's someone who's a resident in Cape Town. Now you imagine someone working there who gets that experience every single day. Then what happens is you create, and you've done it so well, you've created restaurant experiences that are pulling people into the precinct because they want to go to Ongetem as a great restaurant. And then you build a hotel that's attached to that restaurant. So now all of a sudden the international brand is now bringing people into your precinct. So you know what, in our precinct world, we call this, there's this term stickiness. You've created stickiness at Longkloof, because now all of a sudden people want to be in this nice urban, edgy environment, completely different to the waterfront. But it's got all those ingredients to create the stickiness for ultimately that commercial tenant who is his anchor tenant to say, I want to be there because I look at all this people and all these experiences around me.
Werner, let's bring you in back again into the conversation. And I like the term stickiness, but I can't imagine it in my mind how investors experience stickiness. What is the process there? What are you offering investors other than experience? Because if they haven't been there, but I would imagine they are looking at money. So what are investors looking for?
So if you look at the fundamentals of property, you sign a lease with a specific tenant for X amount of years. So for example, 5 years, the lease escalates at a specific rate. And then after year 5, you need to actually sign a new lease. Now, then the real negotiations starting again, you know, so you need to see, you know, is the lease going down, you know, is there other options for the tenant to actually move around within a specific area? And if you create amenities around these specific office, and I'm talking about office and retail in general, if you create that environment, you create a stickiness factor where the tenant will say, listen, there isn't actually any other area or precinct that I want to go to. You know, that's case in point, you know, that happens regularly in the V&A as well. You know, where tenants, you know, they will actually rather commute a bit further, you know, just to stay in that specific precinct. You know, people, they will have an opportunity closer by, but they want to be in that environment. So I think, you know, if you create that work, live and play environment for people in a specific precinct, you know, you will actually eventually create that stickiness that will actually result into superior investment returns for shareholders at the end as well.
Talking to all three of you, looking at global trends on mixed-use precincts, what's hot and what's coming onto the market that you think would work for South Africa?
Precincts is also unique on a country level as well. You know, a precinct might actually look totally different in South Africa than a precinct in Europe, for example. You know, I think one of the key important things for a precinct in South Africa is security. Also, maintaining the urban infrastructure around a precinct is also very important for us in South Africa. So it's a little bit of a different dynamic than if you directly look at what's happening abroad. However, I know that the development teams are regularly scouting around the world, looking for opportunities, ideas, you know, that they can bring to South Africa. And, you know, that's an ongoing thing. So, you know, definitely something that we keep our eye on. But, you know, there is a uniqueness into precincts in South Africa.
And before we move on to Graham, Werner, I just want to ask, for investors who seem to be maybe still on the fence about mixed-use presence, what are some of the things that you can tell them? Some may think residential doesn't quite fit in there, or affordable housing may not fit in there, even though you're talking about accessibility. What would be your answer to that?
You want to spread your risk from an investment profile perspective. So you will have a balance between the amount of retail, the amount of office, the amount of residential. And in some instances as well, you will have industrial buildings also in specific precincts as well. So, and each one of those asset classes have their own risk profile associated to it.
Can I add just one concept about international trends and what's important? Even internationally, you'll see a lot of focus on neighborhoods. Yeah. So if I take London as an example, you'll hear me talk about Spitalfields, you'll hear me talk about King's Cross and these neighborhoods. And I think it's speaking to a greater need that people have for connectivity. So I think where over the years things become more electronic and distanced, people feel the need to belong. And I think when we talk about precincts, we're actually talking about neighborhoods. And we will see more and more of that, where I want to be where I feel at home. Yeah. And I think that concept's going to come through a lot louder and a lot clearer. Things at human scale where people feel that they can connect is really important. It's an emotional connection that people are after.
Yeah, King's Cross is such a good example, because I remember being in the UK 25 years ago. King's Cross, you dare not go out. Yeah. It was a harsh environment. Now, it's such a cool place to be. There's a new neighbourhood being developed by the same developers called Brent Cross, near Hampstead Heath, and that's exactly what they're doing. So if you think about that context, it's exactly what we're doing at the V&A. We already have a waterfront neighbourhood, but as we grow, there's two things there's one opportunity and there's something we've got to guard against. The opportunity for us when we grow is we're also applying to government to reclaim a portion of the ocean. So we're going to create a greater connection between the waterfront and the ocean on the Granger Bay side. So we're eventually going to connect the Seapoint Promenade all the way through into the V&A and into the city. And why are we doing that? Because we're now going to create an opportunity for people to want to be in that neighborhood, for dwell time, to be able to move around the neighborhood. And if we think we're going to be building out additional residential, which is 6,000 households, we've now got to start thinking, how do we create a neighborhood that's going to be a place where people want to be? Now, that also comes down to what additional amenities do we need. So education, medical. Those are two asset classes that we're not exposed to in the V&A. We have a little bit of medical, dentists and doctors, etc., but I'm talking about a proper medical facility. So those are asset classes we're starting to look at. But the thing that I'm worried about as we grow is we've got to still maintain the character of our precinct. So how do we make sure that the character and the heritage of the V&A permeates through the growth that we're going to go through in that expansion of that neighborhood? So that's something that we're working on from a visitor experience point of view. How do we pay respect to our heritage, and how does that heritage come alive in our visitor experience? And how does it inform the precinct character as to how we grow, how we move forward and we grow our precinct?
Well, Timothy, as I listen to Graham talk about experience, it makes me think that people are going back to the office, or is it still hybrid? So when you talk about neighborhoods, it would sound like a very interesting office space to work in. So when you look at the V&A Waterfront, what you've built there for occupiers, what are some of the elements that you think you will take to, say, Gauteng or KZN?
Flexible work exists, and I think it's an advantage. It improves productivity, and people can work in different locations. But often people will talk about, the travel time to work. So you've got to make it worth the trip. And we used the example just now. You spoke about people who can halve their trip and go to one destination. They'd rather travel double the time to go to the right place. Learnings that we have when it comes to precincts, it is around that sense that people want to be here and there's a reason to be here. So we're not competing on how pretty the building is or anything like that. It's how desirable the building is. And I like to focus on the word desirable, because if you make a desirable place and you curate that and you manage that, you're going to be relevant. That's what the waterfront has done, and done incredibly well. But that doesn't mean we can't do it elsewhere and can't have a different focus to meet that particular need.
You're creating a sense of community. That's what you're doing in these precincts. You're creating a sense of community. That's what people want. People want to be together. They want a social connection. Whether you're at work, despite the hybrid working, whether you're at work or whether you're outside of work, people want to be able to have a social connection, a sense of community.
And are there any risks or challenges as you take a look at the present approach for investments? Werner, let me start with you.
There's always, risks and opportunities in precincts. I think, for many years there was a portfolio thinking that you don't want to concentrate your assets into one specific area. However, I think, the mindsets have changed a bit over the recent years that, the integration of decent assets in a specific area can actually elevate your valuation and the shareholder returns eventually. So I think, all of those things you need to manage going forward, and the opportunities is to expand these precincts, and that also means is that your team that works on these precincts can actually be situated in one area for a very long time to develop out these precincts as well.
For me, the important thing is when you build out a precinct is, Tim mentioned it, it's not just about building a set of buildings and saying, okay, well, I've created a precinct. It's how do you create an environment that encourages people to actively explore their precinct? How do they get down into the parks and onto the streets and into the precinct? So the urban design is incredibly important. The sense of placemaking, curating the experiences, activations, public amenities. As the property developers, historically it would be every little piece of available bulk, how can I monetize that? Now, we've got to ensure that when you build precincts, that there's a 15 to 20% at least of public space, public amenity space, so that people can have this amazing sense of place. And that's why the reclamation and the establishment of the bay within the V&A is part of that response to this need for public amenities and public space and the sense of community, as I spoke about.
Yeah, very often we talk about the spaces between the buildings being more important than or as important as the buildings themselves. I think if you're talking about from an investment perspective, the really critical shift when it comes to precinct is the continuous management of that. And it's not just at the fundamental delivery of the basic services that are required, but it's as I said earlier, is managing that experience. And that's different. And that's what keeps that asset relevant into the future. So a building, when it's built, you've got a tenant signed up, it's relevant on day one, but what's it going to be like in 10 years' time? And that's the question that investors will be asking or should be asking, because they're talking about, is it a growth asset or is it one that's in a slow stages of decline? And then I think that's the exciting thing about precincts, because it makes logical sense. If you keep on investing in that asset and making it relevant, it will be as relevant or possibly even more relevant in 10 years' time than it was today. And I think that's the exciting opportunity for investors, knowing that there's active management, not just property management, but also at the experience level, which is not what we've seen historically. And that's the fundamental difference here.
And apart from active management, what are some of the aspects or questions that investors are interested in when they ask about the V&A Waterfront or some of the precincts that you own?
Graham actually mentioned it. One easy example is that every day the V&A needs to show up, or every day a precinct needs to show up. It needs to be clean. It needs to be attractive. People need to want to be there in essence, and that is one key component. You need to actually manage the urban environment in a precinct, taking over almost like a municipal role, and making sure that security is up to standard, and making sure that it's a pleasant experience for all that goes through the precinct.
Yeah, we often talk about the visitor experience, but for us as well, what's incredibly important is the tenant experience. We've got to create an environment where tenants want to be at the V&A because they know there's footfall and there's quality footfall. So it's important that we maintain the precinct, but it's also important that we continue to drive footfall and growth in footfall. And that comes through about the growth that we're doing, but also talk about attractions and experiences. Are we at the cutting edge of what's happening in the food and beverage space? Are we at the cutting edge in terms of what the trends are in retail, and how are we responding to that? How do we respond to those retail trends to be, if not first, at least second, to be able to make sure that we keep on with that relevance, keeping our tenants happy? and encourage churn of tenants because it creates newness.
Capital is a scarce resource and it can move around quite freely. And I think if we're looking at investors, what are they looking for? They're looking for assets that are growth assets. And they'll evaluate the risk and they'll also evaluate the opportunity. And I think what we're seeing here in this precinct type of environment is one where the assets have diversified the risk to some extent and still obviously property assets, but they've also shown good prospects for the future because I spoke earlier about them remaining relevant. And Graham speaks about cutting edge and is it new, is it current? And that's a continuous process. You heard thinking about what's the next attraction. You've got to keep on focusing on that. And I think investors want to know that if they've invested here, this is the projection for this asset and where it can go.
As we wrap up the conversation, I would like to start from you, Timothy. What makes mixed-use precincts successful?
I think what makes mixed-use precincts successful is the fact that they are a fantastic environment for people to live, work and play. And I think that's probably the most critical success factor here is that people want to be there, people feel a connection with it, and therefore because they're emotionally invested, it's going to only progress in the best possible way. I think that's important.
I completely agree with Tim. I don't think there's anything more to add. I think he's got it spot on.
Yeah, I think, maybe something small to add is just it creates that sense of community, belonging, and that will drive your stickiness in that specific precinct.
Mixed-use precincts succeed when they are intentionally curated, well-managed, and are aligned to how people live, work, play, and travel. Their success combines strong financial performance and long-lasting investment value. Thank you to my guests, Werner, Graham, and Timothy for joining us. And to you, our listeners, stay tuned for the next episode.